I remember the first time I heard about that Alaskan hunter who learned to melt snow with nothing but the quiet patience of a man who no longer measures his days the way most people do. For it was said that he did not approach the world with the hurried steps when counting minutes, but with the slow breath of someone who listened. It is strange how stories like his reach us long before we step into the mountains, as if the wind carries them ahead of us to prepare our thoughts for a different kind of life. People often think that a man who chooses solitude is running from something, yet those who truly know the stillness of the high places understand that many who walk into the cold go there not because they are fleeing, but because they're finally ready to arrive. And when I first followed the traces of this hunter through the old paths left by others, I realized that the appeal of his life was not in the details of the tools he crafted or the remarkable net he fashioned from nothing but water and time, but in the quiet certainty that he belonged to that vast wide world where the whole stretches any man. The mountain itself is not simply a place where a man lives. It is a presence that walks with him, shaping his thoughts, slowing down what needs to be slowed and awakening what needs to be awakened. When you step into a land where the cold carries its own song and the ground beneath your feet remembers more winters than you can imagine, something inside you begins. You start to feel the silence as if it were a companion rather than an absent, and the simple act of breathing becomes a way of learning. This hunter felt that from the first moment he arrived in Alaska, long before he discovered that the mountain would teach him how to observe snow so carefully, would later become the very thing that helped him craft what many still call the most unusual and effective fishing net ever made. People often picture the snow as just a cold white cover that hides everything beneath it, but he learned to look at it like a living skin with patterns and secrets that reveal themselves only to those who slow down and to see. There were days when he said the snow spoke more truth than any person he had ever met. He could tell from the smallest shift in texture where the wind had traveled the night before. He could sense the thinness that came before the deep freeze returned. He could trace the delicate lines left by creatures too light to disturb the upper layers. And in those quiet hours when the sun barely rose above the ridges and offered a dim silver light across the land, he would kneel, scoop a handful of snow, and let it melt slowly in his palm, feeling the way it changed from solid to liquid, from cold resistance to gentle surrender. It was in those moments that he first began to understand how the mountain could teach him more than any teacher or book ever had. People often underestimate solitude, believing it causes a man to grow bitter or detached, but this hunter found something different entirely. In the vastness of the Alaskan silence, he discovered connection, a deep, intimate relationship with the land that allowed him to sense patterns invisible to those who live surrounded by noise and constant movement. It was that intimacy that gave him the idea that snow, when treated not as a burden, as a resource, could do more than insulate the world in winter. He realized that snow held structure, flexibility, and memory. It remembered wind. It remembered pressure. It changed shape with remarkable willingness, and he began to imagine what could be formed if melted snow were reshaped with intention, with patience, and with the kind of attentiveness only a solitary man could achieve. One might wonder how such a simple material could inspire the creation of something as functional as a fishing net. But nothing in the mountains is truly simple. Everything carries layers of meaning, even the smallest flake resting on your glove. As he spent more time alone, he noticed that melting snow behaved differently depending on where it came from. The snow near the ridges tasted mineral-rich, flavored by the ancient stone beneath it. The snow from the sheltered valleys melted into water so clear it almost seemed to disappear against his skin, and the snow near the riverbeds, where the wind carved long, narrow patterns, melted into threads that clung together with an unusual. The hunter began melting snow in bowls of old spruce, watching the way the water pooled, cooled, and eventually refroze along the. And slowly, carefully, he discovered that thin strands of refrozen snow water could be shaped, stretched, and woven together into something flexible and surprisingly strong. Of course, he did not set out intending to create anything remarkable. The beauty of his life is that nothing he made was born from ambition or pride. Everything he crafted came from need, curiosity, and the desire to live in harmony with the land that sheltered. He watched the animals and learned from them, noticing how the beavers used certain natural fibers and how the river ice formed long crystalline threads beneath the surface during the first freeze. These observations became the quiet foundation of his idea. It took him months of experimentation, melting and refreezing, stretching and testing, before he created the first version of the net. And that first version was not perfect. It barely held its shape, slipping apart when he tried to use it. But he did not give up, for he knew that the mountain gives its lessons slowly, never all at once. People who live far from the wilderness may think obstacles like these would frustrate him, but for a man who loves the mountains deeply as he did, each failure was simply another part of the conversation he held with nature. He felt joy in noticing where the strands weakened. He felt calm in reshaping late in the long winter night. And every time he stepped outside his cabin, breathed in the cold air, and looked across the frozen expanse, he knew there was nowhere else he would rather be. The mountain was not a punishment. It was not an escape. It was home in the purest sense, the kind of home that grows inside your bones until leaving it would feel like cutting away a part of yourself. And it was in this peace, this acceptance, that he found the clarity to refine his craft until the net he made did not simply catch fish, but worked with the rhythm of the water itself. When he finally created the net that would become known as the most effective one ever made in those remote places, he did it not with satisfaction. He wove the threads of refrozen snow water with a steady hand, understanding exactly how each one would respond when submerged in icy current. The net glided through the water like it belonged there, disappearing beneath the surface with an elegance no manufactured tool could match. It was light, strong, and perfectly suited to the cold Alaskan rivers. Neighbors who lived days away heard tales of it, carrying admiration in their voices whenever they spoke of the hunter who had turned snow into sustenance. And he simply nodded, never boasting, never claiming genius. He always said the mountain had made the net. He had only listened. If you have ever felt drawn to solitude, if you have ever sensed that there is a quieter world waiting for you beyond the noise and the rush, then you might understand why this story matters. It is not about crafting tools. It is not about surviving harsh winters. It is about learning to move at the pace of nature, discovering that the answers you seek do not come from force, but from observation. Many people carry a quiet longing in their hearts, a desire to breathe more deeply, to reconnect with something simple and real. And perhaps that is why this hunter and his melted snow remain so unforgettable. His story reminds us that sometimes the path to understanding begins with the simplest act of paying attention. If you are listening to this story now, I would love for you to share in the quiet spirit of this mountain moment by letting me know where you are watching from, because every place carries its own cup of silence, and I am always curious about the landscapes that surround those who journey with me through these narratives. He often said that a man does not arrive at a life of solitude all at once, because the path that leads someone into the mountains is usually shaped long before he even realizes he is walking. The hunter's past was not filled with dramatic escapes or broken pieces scattered behind him. Instead, it was built from quiet moments of misalignment, the kind that many people experience but seldom understand. He grew up in a small town where the rhythm of life was quick but not meaningful, full of voices spoke loudly yet rarely said anything lasting. He remembered sitting on his porch as a boy, listening to the distant calls of birds, the soft rustle of trees, and feeling that the deeper truth of the world lay somewhere just beyond the edge he could see. Even then, he sensed he was meant for different, though he had no words to describe it. As he grew older, he tried to follow the expectations set before him, working hard, participating in the patterns of normal civilization, and giving his energy to responsibilities that never truly felt like his own. He was not unhappy, but he felt disconnected, as if each day moved him further away from the quiet center he longed for. He spent years observing people rush toward goals that seemed to hold no real meaning, and he realized he wanted something more elemental, something that felt aligned with the natural rhythm of the world, rather than the frantic pace of human demand. It was not disappointment that shaped him, but clarity, a growing recognition that his heart was tuned to the slower, deeper pulse of the wild. That understanding, once it surfaced, refused to fade. There was a moment in his early adulthood that he often recalled as the turning point. Though it was not a dramatic event. He had been walking along the outskirts of town after a long week, feeling the weight of obligations that seemed endless, when he found himself standing before a small creek that flowed much more quietly than the life he was living. He crouched beside it, placed his hand in the icy water, and felt something shift inside him. The cold did not make him recoil. Instead, it awakened him in a way he had never felt before. The stillness around the water seemed to whisper that there was another path waiting, one that would not require him to become someone else, but would allow him to finally return to the person he was meant to be. He stayed by that creek for hours without moving, listening to the gentle flow, watching the way the light played across its surface. When he eventually stood up, he knew he could no longer pretend that the life he was living was the one his soul recognized. His decision to move toward isolation was not a sudden escape, but a slow and intentional shift. He began spending longer periods in the wooded areas beyond his town, walking without destination, sleeping beneath the open, and discovering a sense of belonging in the whisper of leaves and the distant call of. The more time he spent outside, the more he felt his thoughts settle into a gentle order. He noticed that the worries that consumed people around him had no place in the quiet spaces of nature. The forest did not demand anything from him. It did not judge or measure his worth. It simply existed, welcoming him with a calm that felt deeper than anything he had experienced before. Over time, he saved enough to travel north, guided by stories of a vast land where the winter tests a man's resolve and the wilderness stretches far beyond the reach of human noise. Alaska called to him not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. It did not pretend to be easy, and he respected that. When he arrived, he felt the shock of cold air wrap around him like a greeting. The landscape spread before him in endless whites, blues, and grays, yet he saw warmth. He felt something inside him click into place, as if he had stepped into a world that had been waiting for him long before he knew it existed. In those early years, he learned the ways of the land through experience rather than instruction. He built his cabin slowly, using local wood, shaping each piece with the same patience he would later apply to the melted snow. He learned where the moose migrated, how the wolves moved when the wind changed, and how the rivers froze in layers that mirrored the. He was not running from society, nor was he seeking to hide from people. He simply found that the mountain offered the kind of companionship he had longed for his entire life, a companionship made not of words, of presence. There were people who questioned his choice, calling it loneliness or abandonment, but he never saw it that way. To him, solitude was not absent, it was fullness. It allowed him to listen to the quiet voice he had ignored for so many years. It was in that stillness that he discovered who he truly was. The mountain did not make him feel isolated. It made him feel understood. Every sunrise that stretched across the snow felt like a promise. Every night, sky heavy with stars, felt like a story being told just for him. And every challenge, every storm, every bitter wind felt like a reminder that life is most meaningful when lived with intention. People often assume that a man chooses a solitary life because he carries sorrow or burden. But for this hunter, the opposite was true. He chose solitude because it brought him joy. He loved the sound of the wind sweeping across the frozen land. He loved the way the snow shifted under his boots. He loved the calm that came with each morning when he stepped outside and breathed in the icy air. Even the hardships brought him satisfaction, for they connected him to the world in a way that no comfort ever could. When he chopped wood in the deep winter, he felt the strength of his own body. When he tracked animals, he felt the intelligence of the land guiding. And when he sat by the river, watching the water move beneath thin layers of ice, he felt the kind of peace that people spend their whole lives searching for without realizing it grows from simplicity. As years passed, his connection to the mountain grew into something almost instinctive. He no longer needed to think about how to navigate its trails or how to endure its winters. He understood the land the same way one might understand an old friend, recognizing its moods, patterns, its subtle shifts. And though he lived alone, he never felt lonely. The silence around him was not empty, but companionship. It carried ancient wisdom, the kind that cannot be found in crowded rooms or busy streets. He felt grateful every day for the life he had built, a life shaped not by pressure or expectation, but by an honest desire to exist in harmony with the world. His past began to feel like a distant echo, something remembered with affection but no longer needed. He was not escaping anything. He had simply stepped into the place where he belonged. And it was in this belonging that he eventually discovered the inspiration that guided him to melt snow, shape water, and craft the remarkable net that became part of a local legend. The creation did not stem from desperation. It was born from a quiet moment of observation, the same kind of moment that had once led him to the creek back home and awakened his desire for a life of meaning. Many who hear his story think the net is the most extraordinary part, but those who truly understand solitude know that the real miracle is how a man can transform his life by listening to the quiet truths he once ignored. His journey from a restless young man to a calm, solitary hunter is not a tale of loss, but of discovery. It shows how stepping away from noise can allow someone to step fully into themselves. It shows that sometimes the greatest freedom is found in the simplest living, and it reminds anyone who hears it that fulfillment does not always come from having more, but from needing less. Before we move on, if this part is flowing well for you, I would be glad to continue. And if you feel connected to this story, consider subscribing so you can follow the full journey as we move deeper into the mountain and into the life of the man who found peace there. Life in silence is not what many imagine. People often think of silence as an empty space, something hollow or lacking in movement, but the hunter understood it as a living element that shaped his days as surely as the snow shaped the land. He would often say that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that truly matters, because it allows a man to hear things he could never perceive in the constant buzz of ordinary life. The silence of the mountain was layered and full, carrying the soft whisper of distant wind, the faint crackle of settling ice, the far-off calls of birds tracing their path across sky. In that quiet, he found a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat, and each morning when he stepped outside his cabin, he felt the world welcome him with a calm that made the simplest tasks feel meaningful. His routines were shaped not by clocks or schedules, but by the natural flow of the land that surrounded him. He woke a slow brightening, often before the sun rose fully, and he would sit for a moment at the edge of his door, breathing in the crisp air that tasted pine and frost. He learned to read the sky others might read books, noticing the subtle shifts in color that revealed what kind of day lay ahead. If the morning light carried a faint shimmer of gold, the weather would remain clear. If a thin gray veil stretched across the horizon, snow might arrive by nightfall. These signs guided his movements, telling him when to travel farther, when to gather wood, and when to remain close to the warmth of his cabin and tend to quieter tasks. The cabin itself was a space shaped by intention rather than decoration. Everything inside had a purpose. The small wooden table held the marks of years of use, carved by tools, meals, and experiments with snow water. His shelves were filled with jars of herbs he had gathered from the surrounding fields, each one chosen for its ability to bring warmth or healing when needed. In the corner rested his fishing gear and the early versions of the net that would one day become his signature creation. But the most valuable thing in that room was the stillness that settled over it. When he worked inside the cabin, he often did so without speaking a word, allowing his mind to rest in the peaceful quiet that wrapped around him like a soft blanket during the coldest night. He took long walks each day, not because he needed to travel anywhere specific, but because moving through the land made him feel alive. The snow beneath his boots carried a rhythm that matched the steady pace of his breathing, and as he walked he often ran his hand along the bark of trees or paused to examine the patterns left by animals in the snow. These patterns were stories to him, proof that life pulsed through the mountain even when the world was frozen. He traced the delicate steps of rabbits, the broader prints of fox, and the deep, steady tracks of moose making their way toward the river. Every mark was a message from the land. He read them with the reverence of who understood that some winter days were filled with a cold so sharp that it seemed to cut through every layer of clothing, yet he felt more comfort in that biting air than he ever had in the warmth of crowded rooms. He loved the way the cold demanded presence, the way it forced him to move deliberately, breathe deep, remain attentive. He believed that cold taught a man discipline, because in the harshest weather there was no room for distraction or carelessness. Even simple tasks became meditative. Building a fire became an act of focus. Gathering ice became a moment of reflection, and melting snow for water became a quiet ritual that reminded him of the mountain's generosity. He often sat by the river, even when the surface froze into long sheets that reflected the pale sky like a mirror. Beneath the ice, he could hear the water moving with a soft, persistent murmur. It reminded him that even in stillness there is motion, and even in silence there is life. The river was the place where he observed the delicate forms of it. Later inspired him to weave his unique. He noticed how thin filaments formed beneath the surface during the earliest freezes, stretching like translucent threads that caught the light in strange and beautiful. These natural formations taught him that strength is not always visible, and that the most resilient materials are often the ones shaped slowly and patiently by the world. In the evenings, he returned to his cabin, where the fire cast long, wavering shadows along the wall. He cooked simple meals, often fish caught earlier that, and he ate with appreciation born from effort. Food tasted different in the mountain. It carried the memory of cold rivers and long walks, and he found satisfaction not just in the taste, but in the understanding that every bite represented a connection to the land he loved so deeply. After eating, he spent long hours reflecting, sketching ideas in a notebook made of rough paper, capturing thoughts about snow, water, and the patterns he noticed in nature. These reflections were not forced. They flowed naturally from a mind that had learned to slow down and observe. At night, When the wind curled around the cabin, he often stepped outside to gaze at the stars. The sky in the mountains was unlike anything he had ever known before. It stretched endlessly overhead, free from the haze and brightness of town, revealing constellations he had never seen so clearly. The stars seemed to pulse with life, reminding him that even in his solitude, he was part of a vast, interconnected world. He felt no fear in that immensity, only comfort. The universe did not intimidate him. It embraced him, offering a sense of belonging that went beyond words. His solitude was not an escape from people, but an embrace of himself. He learned to understand his own thoughts in ways he never could, surrounded by noise. He learned that contentment does not come from constant interaction, but from alignment with one's inner path. The silence allowed him to listen to the faintest signals within his own mind, helping him understand what brought him joy and what weighed on him. Over time, he discovered that he needed little to feel complete. A warm fire, sturdy shelter, a snow-filled landscape, and a purpose that grew naturally from his bond with the land were enough to fill his day's meaning. On some mornings, he woke with memories of his previous life drifting faintly through his mind, like old dreams no longer belonged to him. He remembered people he once knew, places he once visited, and tasks he once considered important. But these memories did not bring longing or sorrow. They simply reminded him of the path he had walked to reach the mountain. He felt gratitude for the experiences that shaped him, yet he knew with absolute certainty that he would not return to that old rhythm even if given the chance. The mountain had become a part of his identity. It had taught him more about himself than any conversation or lesson ever had. Living there felt not like a decision, but like a homecoming. Sometimes birds perched near his cabin, watching him with curious eyes. He often spoke softly to them, not expecting a response, but enjoying the gentle presence of another living being. These interactions were simple, yet they reinforced his belief that companionship does not always require conversation. Even the animals understood the peace that settled around his home. They sensed he was not a threat, that his presence blended naturally into the landscape. The foxes that passed nearby did not flee when they saw him. The moose that wandered through the valley continued slow, determined steps without pause. They recognized him as part of the land just as he recognized. As seasons shifted, he followed the patterns with a kind of devotion. Spring brought subtle warmth, a soft loosening of snow that signaled the rivers would soon swell. Summer brought long days where the sun lingered in the sky, casting golden light across a peak. Fall arrived with crisp air and colors that painted the landscape deep red and burnt oranges, and winter, the season he loved most, returned with quiet authority, wrapping the world in cold stillness. Each season its own lesson, and he welcomed them all, calm of someone who understood time in the mountain meant to be lived fully rather than hurried through. During one especially quiet winter, he began refining the early versions of his net, testing different ways of melting and refreezing snow water. These experiments became an extension of his life in silence. The process required patience, attentiveness, and an ability to notice small details that many would overlook. He melted snow in shallow wooden bowls, observing how the water settled and how its clarity changed depending on its source. He watched the way the edges thickened when exposed to cold air, forming thin ribbons that could be pulled gently into threads. He learned that the secret to the net's strength was not in forcing the threads into shape, but in allowing them to form naturally, guided cold self. In this way, his life in silence became the foundation of one of the most remarkable creations ever made in those remote regions. But the true significance of its days was not in the invention itself. It was in the way he lived, the way he embraced the quiet world around him with gratitude and joy. He found fulfillment where others might find emptiness, and he discovered meaning in every challenge the mountain offered. His solitude was not a burden. It was a blessing he cherished more with each passing year. There came a time when the mountain tested the hunter in ways he had never experienced before, not through cruelty, but through the natural challenge that comes to every man who chooses to live in such close communion with the wilderness. It began during a long and relentless winter, the kind that presses down with a heavy silence that feels almost physical, when even the sound of one's breath seems to vanish into the cold. The snow fell in thick, unbroken layers for weeks, burying the familiar path, covering the riverbanks, and sealing the land beneath a vast white stillness. Food became harder to find, and the river that had always given him life froze deeper than he had ever seen before. The ice grew thick and stubborn, refusing to break even when he struck it with the full force of his arm. For the first time in many years, he felt a quiet uncertainty stirring within. Yet even in that moment, he did not feel fear. He only felt the mountain calling him to look closer, to think differently, to find a new way of listening. The days grew shorter, and the sun lingered only briefly, casting a pale light that vanished quickly, and the hunter found himself instinct more than his supply were limited. His understanding. He began exploring areas he had not visited before, walking carefully through drifts that reached his knees, marking his trail so he would not lose his way in the storms that came without warning. It was during one of these walks that he noticed something unusual: the frozen river. Beneath a thin section of ice near the bank, the water still moved, faintly, but he knelt and placed his gloved hand against the surface, feeling the pulse, the current beneath. It was there that the idea, which had once been nothing more than a quiet observation, began to take form in his mind with a clarity that only hardship can bring. He realized that the mountain was not denying him what he needed, but was instead offering him a lesson in truth. The ice that had trapped the river was the same element staining him. Snow, water, and cold were not obstacles. They were materials waiting to be understood. That night, as he sat by the fire in his cabin, he melted snow in a small pot and watched as the steam curled upward, disappearing into the dark air. He thought about how that same snow could shift its nature depending on the warmth or cold it met, how it could turn from solid to liquid again, carrying within it both fragility and strength. The thought lingered as he drifted to sleep, and by morning he woke the renewed purpose. He began experimenting again, but this time with the urgency of survival guiding his patience. He gathered snow from different parts of the mountain, melting each sample separately and studying the way it refroze when exposed to different temperatures. Some batches formed brittle shards, others formed long, supple strands that clung together like thin fibers. He began to see patterns, understanding that the snow was influenced by the air it had fallen through, the wind that had shaped it, and the minerals it had absorbed, touched. Slowly, through observation and trial, he discovered certain combination produced a water that refroze with remarkable cohesion, strong enough to be shaped into threads that could withstand. He used simple wooden frames to stretch the threads, allowing them to freeze in the open air. At first, they snapped under pressure, breaking into tiny crystalline fragments, but he adjusted, learning that the secret lay not in freezing them too quickly, but in letting them harden gradually under the steady cold of the night. He found that by twisting the strands gently, the fibers fused into a single, flexible cord. When he wove these cords together, they formed a net unlike anything he had seen before. It shimmered faintly in the light, delicate yet durable, almost invisible when held against the snow. He could hardly believe what he had made. It looked too fragile to be useful, yet something in his heart told him it would hold. The next morning, he carried the net to the river. The air was so cold that his breath turned instantly to frost. He cut a narrow opening in the ice where the water still moved beneath and lowered the net carefully into the current. For a long time, nothing happened. He crouched beside the hole, listening to the soft sound of the river moving below, wondering if he had misjudged the strength of his creation. But then, just as he began to lift the net, he felt resistance. When he drew it up, it emerged heavy with fish, their silver bodies glinting through the icy mist. The net had not only held, but had done so with an ease and grace that astonished. The strands flexed in the water, allowing it to flow through without tearing, catching the fish as though the river itself had helped guide them in. He stared at it in silent awe, understanding that he had not simply made a tool, but had uncovered a principle that belonged to the mountain. The success of that moment was more than survival. It was discovery. He realized that by melting snow and letting it refreeze according to the laws of the cold rather than his own force, he had created something perfectly balanced between nature and human intention. The mountain had taught him the lesson he needed most, that strength and gentleness are not opposites but partners, that even the harshest elements contain within them the power to sustain life if approached with respect and understanding. He carried the fish back to his cabin that day, not with triumph, but with gratitude, feeling that he had participated in something sacred. Over the following weeks, he refined his technique, learning how to weave the snow strands more efficiently, how to treat them with mineral water to add subtle flexibility, and how to store them so that the cold preserved their structure. He began crafting nets for different conditions, some designed for deeper waters, others for shallower currents. Each one held the same quiet, blending the softness of melted snow with firmness of the cold shaped it. The hunters and trappers who lived far beyond his valley eventually heard of his creation through passing travelers, and though few ever met him in person, they spoke of his net with reverence, calling it the snow water weave, a tool born from patience and the deep understanding of solitude. What set this creation apart was not only its function, but its philosophy. It represented a way of living that mirrored the hunter's own approach to life, attentive, slow, and rooted in cooperation with the world rather than domination over it. The mountain had not been conquered, it had been conversed with. Each strand of his net was a reflection of that dialogue, and every time he used it, he was reminded that his success came not from mastery, but from humility. He had listened, and the mountain had responded. The challenge he faced during that long winter became the turning point in his story, not because it threatened him, but because it revealed to him the depth of his bond with the land. From that point on, he no longer saw hardship as something to be endured, but as something to be understood. When storms came, he welcomed. When rivers froze solid, he studied them. When the winds grew fierce, he stood outside to feel their force and learn their rhythm. He no longer asked how to resist the mountain, but how to move with it. And in doing so, he found a kind of peace that no comfort or safety could offer. It is easy to look at a man like him and see only resilience. The truth is that his strength came from gentleness. He approached every difficulty with curiosity instead of frustration. He found meaning in the smallest details, and through that attention, he created a life that most would consider impossible. His net became a symbol of that balance, a delicate creation born from the union of fragility and endurance, a reminder that the same elements that can destroy can also sustain, depending on how we choose to meet them. As the harshest part of that winter finally began to fade, he stood by the river one evening, watching the light return to the sky. The snow shimmered faintly under the last rays of the sun, and the air carried a stillness felt almost alive. He smiled, not because he had survived, but because he had understood. The world, he realized, does not reward those who fight it, but those who listen. The net in his hands was proof of that truth, and he knew that from that moment forward, every challenge he faced would be met not with resistance, quiet gratitude. And if you have been following this story, if the silence and strength of this man speak to something inside you, I invite you to stay with me and continue walking through his journey. Subscribe so you do not lose the next part of his life, where the lessons of the mountain begin to unfold beyond survival and into understanding. With the passing of that long winter, the hunter began to see the mountain not merely as a home, but as a living reflection of his own thoughts. Every shape of snow, every flicker of light across the ice seemed to mirror something within him. The solitude that once felt like choice had by then become as natural to him as breathing. He no longer measured time in days or months, but in the slow rhythm of the season, in the sound of the river thawing, or the first call of birds returning after the deep cold. His understanding of the world had changed completely. He no longer saw nature as something separate from himself. It was not a landscape outside of him, it was a part of him, an extension of his body and mind. When he walked, the land seemed to move with him. When he listened, the silence itself seemed to breathe. He often sat for long hours beside the river, holding his net, not to fish, but to think. The net, made from melted snow and patient intention, had become more than a tool. It was a symbol of harmony between man and mountain, between action and stillness. He would run his fingers along its strands, feeling their cool texture, and reflect on the simple truth that all things in life are connected through transformation. Snow becomes water, water becomes ice, ice returns to snow. The cycle repeats endlessly. Within it lies every lesson a man could ever need. He understood now that his own life followed the same rhythm. The hardships he had endured were not obstacles, but necessary seeds that shaped into what he had become. In those quiet moments, he began to think about the world beyond the mountain, the places where people rushed from task to task, believing themselves free while trapped by invisible schedules. He thought of how noise fills the spaces where silence should, how light blinds people from seeing the stars, how abundance dulls the sense of gratitude. He did not judge those lives, for he had once lived among them, but he could not help feeling that the modern world had forgotten the simple art of listening to one's own thought, to the rhythm of breath, to the earth turning beneath one's feet. The mountain had restored that lost ability in him. It had given him back the stillness that civilization had taken away. Sometimes he wondered what people would think if they saw the life he lived. Would they understand the contentment that comes from simplicity? Would they see the beauty in waking each day to the sound of wind and of voices? Would they realize that happiness can exist, that peace does not require comfort? He suspected few would truly many would call his life lonely, difficult, not realize difficult form of. The mountain never promised ease, but it offered meaning, and meaning once found replaces every other desire. He also began to notice how deeply nature mirrors the human spirit. When storms came, he watched the snow swirl violently, knowing that turmoil was part of the process that shaped calm days. When rivers flooded, he saw in their force the same energy that drives men to change their lives. When the ice cracked and melted in spring, he heard in that sound the echo of his own transformation. It became clear to him that the world outside and the world within are made of the same elements. The wind that carved the ridges was the same invisible force that shapes a man's soul when he learns to endure and adapt. The older he grew, the more he spoke quietly to the mountain, not as one might pray, but as one might confide in a friend. He thanked it for its lesson, for the days of peace and for the nights of challenge. He knew that one day he would become part of it completely, his body returning to the soil, his breath to the wind, his silence to the snow. But he did not fear that thought. The mountain had taught him that endings do not truly exist, that every ending is simply a return. He had seen it in the snow melting to feed the rivers, in the leaves decaying to nourish new growth, in the fire that consumed wood only to release warmth and light. everything continued, only in a different form. So it would be with him. He often imagined the world below, the towns and roads, endless chatter, would one day fade into the distant memory. He wondered if humanity could ever remember to live in rhythm with the earth. He believed it was possible. He believed that somewhere within every person exists a quiet longing for simplicity, for silence, for connection to something real. He hoped that stories like his might remind others of that truth, that they might inspire someone somewhere to step away from the noise even for a moment, to breathe deeply and feel the slow pulse of the natural, because to know that pulse is to know oneself. He learned to see wisdom in everything around him. The fox that moved through the snow taught him how to walk softly. The trees that stood through endless winters taught him patience. The fire that consumed his wood each night taught him acceptance. Even his mistakes became teachers. There were times when his nets tore, when the weather turned unexpectedly, when the river claimed what he had worked hard to gather. But he no longer saw these things as losses. They were reminders. Control is an illusion. The mountain allows what it allows, and resisting that truth only leads to frustration. When something was taken, he simply nodded, accepted it, and began again. As the years passed, he refined not just his craft, but his understanding of purpose. He no longer sought to make things better or faster. He sought to make them truer. When he repaired his tool, he did so slowly. When he prepared food, he did so with calm attention. When he spoke to travelers who occasionally passed through his valley, he listened more than he talked. He had discovered that wisdom is not in the words a man says, but in the silence he keeps between them. And the more he listened, the more he realized how little he needed to say. There was one particular day that stayed with him for the rest of his life. The snow was melting early, and the river had begun to flow strongly again. He stood on its bank, watching the sunlight shimmer through the current. In that moment, a thought came to him so clear and simple that he laughed out loud. He realized that the greatest discoveries are never about new things, but seeing old things with new eyes. The river, the snow, the mountain, they had always been there. What changed was his ability to see them, to understand what saying all along. That understanding filled him with a joy so profound that it needed no expression. He simply stood there smiling as the wind moved gently through the trees. In the quiet that followed, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him there. A younger version of himself would never, yet every choice, every loss, every restless thought guided him to the solitude that others feared had become his greatest teacher, and the mountain that others saw as harsh had become his greatest companion. He understood now that peace is not something to be found, but something to be remembered, because it has always existed beneath the layers of noise and fear that the world creates. To find it, one must only stop, listen, and allow it to return. He began writing small notes in his journal that year, not for anyone else to read, but to remind himself of what mattered. He wrote that happiness is not a destination, but a state of attention. He wrote that silence is not empty, but full of answers. He wrote that a man's worth is not measured by what he owns, but by how deeply he notices the world around him. And he wrote that love does not always require another person, for one can love the land, the wind, the water, and the act of simply being alive. Those words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a lifetime of learning. In his later years, he sometimes wondered what legacy he would leave behind. He had no family, no heirs, possessions that would outlast him. But he realized that perhaps his legacy was not meant to thing, but a way of being. If someone found his cabin one day, they might see the marks on his table, the worn edges of his net, the simple tools arranged neatly by the fire. They might understand. They might feel the quiet presence that lingered in the air and know that a man had lived there, and if they listened carefully, they might hear what he had heard all his the gentle voice of the mountain speaking. He no longer sought recognition or remembrance. The mountain had already given him everything he needed. What mattered was not that others knew his story, but that they lived their own with the same patience and respect for the world that he had found. And in that simple wish, he felt contentment deeper than any reward the world could offer. He spent many more years in that valley, moving through the cycles of life with the grace of someone who understood each day, no matter how ordinary, holds quiet. The snow continued to fall, the rivers continued to flow, and he continued to listen, learning something new from silence each day. In the last years of his life, the hunter began to notice that the mountain spoke to him in gentler ways. Its storms no longer tested him. Its winds no longer pushed him to prove his strength. Instead, the air around him seemed filled with a deep and quiet understanding, as if the mountain itself accepted him as part of its endless rhythm. He moved more slowly through the snow, not because his body had weakened, but because he had learned that there was no need to hurry. Every step he took was deliberate, every glance at the horizon filled with gratitude. The silence that had once seemed vast now felt intimate, like an old friend leaning close to share secrets that only time can reveal. He had reached a point where his thoughts no longer fought against the world. They flowed with it, gentle and clear as the river water beneath the ice. Each morning he rose with the first hint of light and stood outside his cabin, watching the slow awakening of the valley. The snow reflected the dawn in soft blue tones, and the trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with. He breathed deeply. The air moved through him as if it were his own. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to any listener, thanking it. The words drifted into the cold air and disappeared, but he knew the mountain heard them. Gratitude, he had come to believe, is the truest language a man can speak in such a place. It needs no reply. It only needs sincerity. His days had become simpler than ever. He fished when the river allowed it, using the same net he had crafted so long ago, still strong, still shimmering faintly in the light. He tended his fire, gathered wood, repaired his tools, and rested when his body asked him to. There was no ambition left in him, only calm purpose. Every action was an act of connection, a way of acknowledging his belonging to the land. He no longer thought of the past or the future. He lived entirely in the present moment, knowing that nothing more. The mountain had taught him that time is not a line, circle, and within that circle, all things return to their source. Sometimes, during the long evenings, he would sit beside the fire, reflect the years behind him. He thought of the young man who had once walked away from the noise of town, uncertain but hopeful. He thought of the endless winters, the storms, the discoveries, the slow shaping of his understanding, and he realized every moment, every challenge had been necessary. The solitude that others might have feared had become his greatest teacher. It had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only what was real. He had found peace, not by escaping life, but by entering it fully, without distraction, without fear. The mountain had not isolated him from the world. It had connected him to its. There were nights the sky was so clear, the stars seemed close enough to. He would step outside and tilt his head back, feeling small and infinite at the same time. The stars shimmered across the dark sky like the reflections of forgotten dreams, and he understood that the same quiet power that guided the rivers and the snow also moved through him. In those moments, he felt that death itself was nothing to dread, only another transformation, another change of form in the endless flow of existence. He did not imagine an end, but a continuation. He would return to the mountain the way snow returns to water, the way water returns to the sea, the way silence returns to the wind. There was beauty in that thought, and it brought him comfort. One afternoon, As the spring thaw began, he walked farther than usual along the riverbank. The ice was breaking apart, the sound of cracking echoing through the valley like deep music. He followed the water's edge until he reached a place where the river widened and slowed, forming a calm pool surrounded by smooth stones. He stood there for a long time, watching the current swirl gently around the melting ice. The net hung loosely from his hand. It had served him faithfully for so many years that he could no longer tell where his hands ended and the strand began. The snow that had once melted to create it seemed still alive in its fibers, carrying the memory of countless winters. He lowered it into the water one last time, not to catch anything, but to offer it back. The current accepted it quietly, carrying it away downstream until it disappeared beneath the surface. He smiled as he watched it go. It felt right. Nothing made by his hands truly belonged to him. Everything belonged to the mountain. After that day, he returned to his cabin with a deep sense of completion. He knew his time was drawing toward its quiet close, but he felt no sadness. He continued his routines, tending the fire, walking the familiar trails, listening to the world with the same attentive calm that had guided him all his life. The mountain, in its silent wisdom, gave him peace, even in his final day. The snow fell softly outside, and he found comfort in the rhythm of its descent. He knew that when his breath finally left him, it would rise into the same air he had breathed for decades, becoming part of the endless exchange between man and nature. In those final weeks, he spent many hours writing in his notebook. His words were not meant to be found, yet they carried the quiet wisdom of a man who had lived fully within the truth of his own being. He wrote that life is not about possession, but participation, that the purpose of living is to witness and to give thanks. He wrote that solitude is not the absence of love, but its purest form, because it teaches a man to love without need. He wrote that the mountain, in all its silence, is not distant, but deeply alive, always listening to those who have the patience to hear. And he wrote that peace not given by the world, but remembered within oneself when all distractions fall away. When at last the time came, it arrived gently, the falling. There was no struggle, no fear. He sat by the fire one evening, watching the light flicker on the wooden walls, and simply closed his eyes. The fire burned low. The wind moved softly through the cracks of the mountain, kept it silent. In the morning, the sun rose over the ridge, and the first rays of light touched his still hands with warmth. Outside, the river flowed quietly, carrying with it the memory of the net, the fish, the years, and the life of the man who had once listened so carefully to its song. Later, long after his cabin fell into quiet ruin, travelers passing through the valley sometimes spoke of strange peace that lingered in. They said the air felt different, silence deeper, the snow soft under. Some claimed that when the wind moved through the trees at dusk, it carried a sound like distant breathing, calm and steady, as if the mountain itself were alive with the spirit of the man who had called it home. Whether it was true or not, those who visited left feeling changed. They carried with them a sense of stillness, an unspoken reminder that there are lives lived not in noise and urgency, but in quiet and purpose. And so his legacy lived on, not in fame or memory. His life became part of the landscape, woven into the snow, the water, and the air. The mountain held his story the way the river holds reflection, soft and without pride. And in every flake of snow that fell, in every thread of ice that formed, in every gust of wind that whispered across the ridges, there was a trace of his understanding that to live well is to live with attention, to move slowly enough to hear the world breathe, to give more to take, and to love silent as you would love a friend. If you have listened to this story until now, I want to thank you for walking beside me through the mountain silence and through the life of this solitary man. If his story touched something in you, if it reminded you of the peace that waits all the noise of the world feeling, tell me in the comments where you are listening from, because every landscape has its own kind of mountain, its own kind of silence. Like and share this story if it brought calm to your thoughts. And subscribe so that you can continue to travel with me through other paths of solitude, wisdom, and nature. Every story carries a small truth, and perhaps this one will remind you that even in stillness, life speaks clearly to those who choose to listen.